Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Theory to Practice webinar. We're going to get started. I know some folks will be joining us along the way. Our role as a public university is to talk about important ideas and plant seeds for courageous action. Theory to Practice is an ongoing discussion series hosted by the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance that brings together academics and researchers from across the UW with practitioners in the field to explore key policy, governance, and social sector topics. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today for this discussion on addressing inequities in the philanthropic sector. Just a few housekeeping items as we get started. This session will be recorded and posted on our website for reviewing after the event. We're using the webinar format today, so please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function throughout our conversation. We'll have space during the second half of the conversation to really dive into your questions. Also, if you have resources that you would like to offer to the group during this conversation, please feel free to add those in the chat. We'll be collecting resources mentioned by our panelists and attendees to share back in a follow-up document with all of you. Before we begin, I want to start today by acknowledging the Coast Salish people upon whose land we study and work here at the University of Washington. Their ancestors have resided here since time immemorial, and they continue to live in this place today, deeply rooted in their cultural traditions. We also acknowledge that this country was built from the land theft and genocide of Indigenous communities and enslavement and forced labor of Black people. I know these acknowledgements are just a small gesture, but in making them, we recognize our responsibility to learn and to share this history and to build relationships where together we can create a more just society. With this commitment to learning and given our topic today, I wanted to surface some background information. Only 0.4% on average of charitable giving is directed to Native communities, while American and Alaskan American Indian and Alaskan Native people comprise 2.9% of the population. So there's definitely a gap there. In 2021, white-led nonprofits were also more likely to receive corporate donations, more likely to have revenue from sales, receive funding from federal government, and from investment income from reserves. So, as we're in the midst of what's often called the holiday giving season, I encourage all of us who are here today to discover and give back to BIPOC-led and rooted organizations in our communities. On that note, if you have a favorite org that you'd like to shout out, please feel free to add it to the chat, share it with this group. So with that background, I want to turn to the topic of our today's session. As a sector, philanthropy is beginning to acknowledge and grapple with this inherent dissonance. Though philanthropy's intended purpose is to create positive change, it can also be a driver of continued inequity and harm. The policies and the structures that support charitable giving have perpetuated wealth inequalities, and the practices that many philanthropic institutions have historically employed may cause harm to communities that they are trying to serve. So with that, let's dive into today's conversation and explore some of these systemic challenges, as well as some of the new models that are striving to reduce harm and to shift power to communities that are closest to the work. Let's start with a round of quick introductions. So I am Lauren Domino, the Assistant Dean of Advancement and Innovation here at the Evans School. This topic is near to my heart as I've spent most of my career is in the philanthropic space, in particular, having spent 7 years at Seattle Foundation, which is our local community foundation, when we were in the midst of working really to shift some of our policies and practices to center community voice in a deeper way. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Maria Kolby-Wolfe, President and CEO of the Washington Women's Foundation, and David Suárez, Associate Professor at the Evans School. So I'd love to start by having you each tell us just a little bit about yourself, a little more, and maybe what inspired you or what is calling to you to do this work today. So I'll start with Maria. Maria, would you mind giving us an introduction?
I want to thank you, Lauren, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you here today. A little about myself. I've been in the nonprofit world, mostly here in Seattle, for about almost 20 years now. But I was raised here. I went to other places in between, but I came back home. As I like to say, the mountains and the ocean called me back. I was raised by Northwest hippies. So I spent a lot of time in those mountains. And one of the rules was that you left it better than you found it. And I stand here now with a son in college myself and in a different place, recognizing that there are things in the world that are better and there are things in the world that are not. And finding my way back to a work that involved making the world a better place took a little time. I want to let anybody on this call who is, in fact, a college student to know the path is not always completely clear when you're in college and things go differently than you might think. And but you come back to a place, and I came back to here to Washington Women's Foundation. In many ways, that's the work that I see myself doing, is making the world a better place. And I think philanthropy is one of those places where we might be able to do that. So that's why I'm here in this conversation. And I look forward to more of that conversation today.
Thank you, Maria. How about you, David? Tell us a little more about yourself and the work you're doing.
Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you. My interest in philanthropy and nonprofits goes back to when I was an undergrad studying human rights, and I continued to be interested in that in grad school, which led to interest in the professionalization of the human rights movement. And foundations were quite central to the human rights movement in general, and they continue to be. And so philanthropy, at least institutional philanthropy, has always been an interest of mine. And one thing led to another, went to the Peace Corps, and then became an academic. I thought I would be more directly hands-on doing some of the stuff that Maria is doing, but like she said, we help in different ways, and I ended up in academia, so I'm studying philanthropy now and nonprofits as well. So I can talk much more about the specifics of what I do when we get into our conversation, but I think that sums it up.
Thank you to both of you for being here and for lending us your insights today. So we had a chance, the three of us, to connect about a month ago to start to think about our approach to this conversation, because big topic. There's a lot of things we could explore. And we landed on this notion of thinking about how change happens, right? And this premise that philanthropy should serve as a change agent, or philanthropy has a potential to be a change agent. So with that in mind, I'm curious from your work in the field and through what you're seeing in research and sort of on a bigger picture level, where have you seen philanthropy maybe not live up to this premise? Or what are some of the criticisms or challenges that the philanthropic sector is facing in achieving this goal? Would love to hear from you. Maybe, Maria, what are you seeing in terms of some of these gaps?
Well, I mean, you kind of started talking about it at the very beginning, which is that it is difficult to be a change agent if the dollars that are being spent are not changing the world. Like, philanthropy's been around for a while. There's a lot of systemic shifts that have not yet happened, and that philanthropy evidently has not been able to change. So that's a clear indication that perhaps the way in which is not quite working the way that we would like. Certainly there are places where we can see bright spots, right? There are certainly places where philanthropy has made a difference. It's a grand scale, but the work in malaria and in disease out of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has in fact been kind of extraordinary, some of the stuff that they've been able to accomplish. That said, there's billions of dollars in philanthropy that so little of it goes to the places where it is most needed. I think is a clear indication that a lot of philanthropy is not about change at all. And that is one of the criticisms that I absolutely lay at the feet of those who have the philanthropic power to make a difference and choose to give their dollars into places where change does not happen. So I think that's part of it. And I think that's part of the reason for that inability of those resources to go to where they're needed is because of the very systemic issues that, of course, they're up against, right? Of racism, of sexism, of not seeing the problems, of not understanding the problems. One of the things that we saw at Washington Women's Foundation is that many of those in the donor class, institutional funders, didn't understand how to actually, thought they knew the answers to how to fix the problems and did not know the answers and weren't listening to those who were closest to it. And so I think philanthropy has failed in being a change agent in large part because of that, because they have not actually been proximate, as Brian Stevenson would say, they have not been proximate to the issues they claim they want to fix.
David, I'm curious too. I mean, you sometimes look at this from a global perspective of seeing some trends across different philanthropic institutions, or what are people grappling with and focused on. And I'm curious what you're seeing, where are, foundations struggling perhaps to implement some changes or to address and evolve in this important way that Maria's surfaced.
Sure, and I think I'll pick up on much of what Maria said. The first point really to make here is that a lot of philanthropy is not at all about change, and nor is it intended to be. It can actually be about preventing change. And so there's plenty of philanthropic activity that is considered contributing to the public good, but it is by no means redistributive and not really in any way about changing policy or any of that kind of stuff. So it's I think important to highlight that. But even among those that do, and this is maybe where I'm taking a different tack, is those that are trying to make change. Part of the challenge I see is that it's not always done with the communities they serve. And so it's often, we're seeing a lot more advocacy by foundations. I think there's plenty of research that suggests that foundations are much more engaged in advocacy, even though they're not allowed to lobby specifically. They're doing quite a bit. However, sometimes that is not done with and along with the communities they're serving. It's instead the foundations implementing their own logic model and trying to make change that they see as needed and necessary, which perhaps could be good. And I'm not suggesting it wouldn't be, but part of the challenge that I see is that it's just not necessarily hand in hand with those that they are claiming to serve. And so that's where I see the disjunction.
Yeah, I mean, I want to underscore that idea that in many ways philanthropy has served as a valve release for the pressures and tensions of work that should be getting done by others, like the government of the United States or various other governments, as it may be. That philanthropy does a lot of work feeding and housing and clothing and making things better on a smaller scale than could happen if we did a more systemic approach. So that is where philanthropy sort of stands in the way. So I think that's important to thank you for surfacing that, David.
Yeah, Maria, I think to that end, the added layer of the fact that, just the charitable tax side of that, right? So folks are, in a way, essence, taking some percentage of money out of the public sphere. That's what the tax deduction is there to do, right? Or does, in effect, and then putting it in decision-making of private hands, or some folks that are individual with minimal oversight or public or community voice involvement, perhaps, right? So I think that augments the fact that then they're stepping in to try to fill these gaps. So that's a really interesting. I'm wondering, to explore one other challenge. Maria, you have stepped into leading organization with a long history of collective giving, Washington Women's Foundation. But I'm curious, where have you felt, or where has the organization, even prior to your tenure, experienced some challenges with evolving along the way some of the practices that you all have in place?
So we only have an hour, right? So Washington Women's Foundation is, for those of you who don't know, we're cresting up on 30 years here in Seattle and in the Washington area. And it's a collective giving organization, perhaps obviously so, of people who identify as women. And the ethos is very much, for many, many years, was a very traditional sort of stance around the way in which one gives your money. And I'm not entirely certain that you could say that changing the world was one of the things that was necessarily top of mind. And you can see that if you look at who was getting the donations. There was certainly a desire to make the world a better place. Like that was certainly stated, and that was certainly one of the things that was put forth. But very traditional ways of doing it. LOIs, long proposals, looking at lots of folks, making sure that that nonprofits weren't risky, right? Did they have a succession plan? Do they have cash on hand? Do they have a clear understanding of their financial, like all of those things that made it possible for the women to feel that their money was going to be well stewarded by these nonprofits. And before my time, it was clear that trust-based philanthropy was starting to sort of pick up speed. It was clear that we hadn't made a lot of changes. The world had not become this better place just because we'd been granting into it for hundreds of years, or for 30 years, for hundreds of thousands of dollars, or millions of dollars by that point. And change was needed. And so the first change that happened was prioritizing race and gender inequity in the center of our grant making. That alone caused, I'll be honest, some kerfuffle, right? There were definitely people who felt like that was limiting. That if you prioritize race and gender, you're leaving out all these other things. We felt strongly, and we continued with that belief, that by helping those that have had the most inequities sort of perpetrated upon them, you'll raise things higher, that everybody will raise higher if you start there. So that has continued. And then we took a good hard look at the way in which we did our grant making. We wanted to prioritize sharing power. We wanted to prioritize centering some of those systemic questions that have sort of bubbled to the top. We wanted to prioritize no longer seeing the money as ours, but seeing the money as society's, and that it was for society that we were supposed to. That's what the tax credit was for, right? You get the tax break because supposedly the work that you're doing is going to help better the community. And so that is not our money anymore. It's the community's money, and it should be put into work for them in the way in which they would like to see it happen. We adopted, and we kind of done this already, but it made it very explicit that our gifts were all unrestricted cash. We made it explicit that we were looking for organizations that were led by and for the people that were for lack of a better term, clients. The people that were being served were also the ones who were leading the work. And we coded ourselves in a bit of humility, recognizing that we did not know what we were always talking about. That was a hard one, because this was a group of highly educated, very smart, very successful women who in many ways had built their careers on being smart, the smartest in the room, right? And who had come up with this idea, this deep passion for education, what education can do. And so when we introduced the idea that, in fact, perhaps the people who are closest to the problem know better than you, regardless of their education, what is needed, there were members who found that quite offensive, actually. They had done lots of study. How dare that be the way in which we have come around? In part because we started doing a lot of education. We narrowed down what our grant making was in and started doing deep education on the issues that we were granting in. We had grantees I remember having an interview with one of our grantees who said, "You make big decisions with big dollars and you do not know what you're talking about. And that is not how it should be." And we said, okay, that hurts a little bit, but we're gonna accept it, and we're gonna go forward, and we're gonna say, all right, well then teach us. So we pay everybody to teach us. We're adamant that labor not be given to us for free. But we also, in those 101s that we have about issues, we discovered that, in fact, perhaps we did not know as much as we thought. So one example, we were doing granting in school to prison pipeline. We had people come in to talk about detention and school to prison pipeline, what it looks like and how it works. And they were talking about detention and the impact that happens when children are in detention and then are released to families that are not able to care for them. And that what would happen is those children would stay in detention and for much longer than they were supposed to. And it was pretty obvious. I'm looking around the room and I could see that faces were just like, not terribly like moved by this story. And so I said, could we just get a quick definition of detention? And the panelist was like, it's the youth jail. Like kids get put in the jail and they have to stay there long past when they're supposed to because they don't have a stable family home to go into. And like light bulbs went on. And one of our members was really honest and said, I thought you meant detention like people have to stay after school.
Yeah.
You don't get to grant and stuff if you don't know what you're talking about. And that is a humility that I think a lot of nonprofit foundations, a lot of donors need to sit down and have a little think about because, yeah. And I came out of academia, so I feel like I can say this. Sometimes that academia does not tell you everything that you need to know about what's going on in the world. Like just because you're educated doesn't mean you know what you're talking about. So that was, I think, that was difficult. And then the other, and I apologize, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I promise, David, I promise this will be a panel and not just Maria, blah, blah.
No problem.
The other thing that we did was we started our Rest and Repair Awards. The Rest and Repair Awards was a deep introspective look at the fact that we had been exactly like those folks that Lauren referenced earlier. We had given almost $20 million over the years that we had been in existence, and maybe a couple $100,000 of that had gone to organizations that were run by women of color. And we were a women's organization who were like, we're trying to do change in the world, but we're going to give all our money. If you look at who we gave it to, we gave our money to a lot of white-led organizations. And this was an indication that we said, okay, we had some donors, we had some commitment on the part of our board to put $1 million behind Black women in nonprofits. And, when I came aboard about 2.5 years ago, this was put as, hey, figure out how to give away $1 million for Black women. And I was like, this is the best job ever. So, we sat down and sort of had to think about how we should do this. And I think most of us in the foundation were just thinking we would find 10 organizations that were run by Black women, and we would give them all $100,000 because our gifts are usually $100,000. And that would be, hey, we acknowledge that we've done something. But I was pretty insistent that the people who had to make that decision about how all that money was going to be given had to be Black women. And so I went to my board and I said, we're putting together a cohort of Black women who will make the decision about how this money gets used. If it's going to be for us, it's got to be by us. And my board, who had committed to sharing power, said, okay. So we put together this group of Black women to decide how to give away this $1 million. And over the course of the months, as we talked about that, it became clearer and clearer that we did not feel like giving an organization $100,000 necessarily meant that the women who were in charge of that organization were going to have any rest. In fact, it might mean the opposite, that they were going to be able to just take a break and rest from the weariness of their life. And so they said we shouldn't give the money to the organizations, we should give the money to the women directly, like a MacArthur Genius Award. And I said, thanks, now I have to go back and tell my board that. Excuse me, we're just going to give money away to people. Unrestricted $100,000 gifts to women because they've done amazing things in our community. And my board, God bless them, said yes. They said, okay. I mean, there were some swallows. I feel like there were some whoo, and some deep breaths, but it happened. And so we did. We just made the decision on the 5 for this year. And we gave away $100,000 gifts. It'll be $1 million by the end of this year in cash, unrestricted giving to Black women, nonprofit leaders who have done amazing work in the community. I want to talk about transformative giving. $100,000. One of our members, one of the women who received it last year, is like, I now have enough money for a down payment on a house. Right. Another was, I can pay for my mom's lease. Another took a year to like just focus on her art, which she had not had a chance to do. Another opened a birthing center for, Black and African-American women doulas and maternal health. And another is doing amazing work in the justice system in Tacoma. I want to go back to that down payment on a house. We want to change the wealth gap in America. Maybe what we need to do is just give people money. I'm going to leave it at that. But philanthropy can be transformative, but it has to be bolder. It has to be braver. It has to not get caught up in a whole bunch of rules. There was a lot of fears like, oh, can we give to individuals? Yeah, of course we can. Can we do these things? We can do these things. You just have to do it. So, philanthropy, go do it.
Well, and Maria, to that end, and David, I want to pull some. I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this in your research in particular, but sort of what you've just walked us through is a number of things, right? So this early notion of what is this trust-based philanthropy, this phrase that's sort of like, well, maybe we shouldn't make people fill out crazy applications that take forever if they don't have any profession, especially when many smaller orgs don't have any professional grant writing or development staff, et cetera. This sort of notion of like, let's start to trust more and not require so much process, right? But all the way to this bigger step of, okay, then bringing community voice in to inform, okay, but then actually bringing community voice in to decide, right? Like that's actually shifting power of decision making and dollars, right? All the way through. So I think that's a lot of different pieces that are coming together. And I know, David, you've spent some time thinking about that continuum of what power sharing could look like for organizations. And I would just love to hear some of your perspective on what you're seeing maybe more globally. We have this great example of Washington Women's Foundation and some of the evolutions they have made.
Sure, plenty to talk about. But Maria, I could don't mean to speak for everyone else, but I could hear you talk for an hour, so it'd be no problem. Let me distinguish a few things. There are efforts to democratize philanthropy, and those are important and they are ongoing. Things like crowdfunding, some forms of collective giving would fit in this category. Giving circles, things that bring new individuals into philanthropy, but they're not necessarily sharing power. So if you have some form of collective giving where you have 10 individuals who've never given before and they get together and they decide that they're going to give $100,000, but they're going to decide where that money goes, that's still collective giving, and it is democratization of philanthropy in the sense that you're getting more people involved in philanthropy, but it's not sharing the power, right? And so that is an important for me distinction when we talk about what power sharing is and what that entails in philanthropy. So there's several different approaches to power sharing in philanthropy that are, I guess, trending at the moment. The original, at least as far as I'm aware, would be the social justice philanthropy. Some of the organizations that were associated with the funding exchange pioneered forms of activist-led grant making, such that yes, the wealthy individuals who had contributed just handed over these resources and in effect said, we're going to let the activists decide where this goes. And that's been going on for 30, 40 years, but these were public foundations, not your conventional private foundations that we often think of. So the newer trends that we're seeing, one is in international development called community philanthropy. That kind of gets confused sometimes with other movements, but hashtag share the power is I think you could find plenty of stuff there. Then you have trust-based philanthropy. Trust-based philanthropy is an approach that shares power in some ways, but not others, right? They don't give the grant-making power to the communities that they're serving necessarily, but they do give the grantees much more flexibility to do the work that they have been given resources to do. So I think they would probably agree with me here, but it's not necessarily about the grant making itself. So it's if there's one positive thing that's come out of COVID, and I'm hesitant to say anything positive came out of COVID, but the idea that nonprofits don't need to necessarily be evaluated and assessed for every 5 minutes of everything they do. And so that is something that trust-based philanthropy has done a lot with. I've been working myself on something called participatory grant making, which is, in many respects similar to what I described with social justice philanthropy, and to some extent with community philanthropy as well. It is very much intended to turn over the decision-making power to the communities that are benefiting from this work. And so, just as Maria said, if you bring some people together and say, hey, maybe you're not the right people to be deciding this, it's a different level of magnitude, I'd say, when you say this to a very large foundation and try to convince them that they should delegate this decision-making power to the communities they serve. And so it is happening. It is slow, but it is positive. So I want to make it clear that there are bright spots, and there is evidence of some foundations, large and small, that are trying to implement participatory grant making, not simply because they believe that it will lead to better grant decisions, right? There's two ways to look at it. One is that it leads to better grant making, which it may, right? But the other is that this is a long-term investment in the communities and community building itself. So it's not just about the grants. You're also building community through this function of participatory grant making. So those are the trends that I see. They're related to much of what Maria said, but now I feel like I'm going on a lot, so I'll stop there.
No, this is great. And I'll say it actually leads in really well. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we're getting from our audience, because we have a really rich number of questions that I want to make sure we can start to address. One of them is sort of leading into, we've already started making this shift in the conversation, but what else? What are the other bright spots? I mean, we've talked about some of the challenges, but are there other bright spots you're seeing in philanthropy that we want to surface now as examples of where we could be heading?
Just really quickly, I mean, the examples I gave of the trends. So whether you call it participatory grant making, whether you call it community philanthropy, hashtag share the power, or social justice philanthropy, whatever term you use, I think all of the efforts to increase participation, and by participation I don't mean just listening, I mean engaging and delegating, giving power to the communities, because participation can mean a lot of things, and it doesn't always necessarily mean listening to, it just means involving. So to me, the bright spots, there are some that are doing this. So, we can name names of specific organizations, but to me, just focusing on these efforts of these trends and whatever label we give to them, I view those as unambiguous bright spots.
I'll tell you, Lauren, what's been striking me as a bright spot is something that happens actually, because I teach at the UW certificate class. And one of the things that we asked our class this year was like, how many of your organizations are doing advocacy work? And we've asked that question before. And we've got like, none, or I don't know. And this year, it was a majority of the folks that were in the room were like, oh yeah, my organization is looking at that. And foundations are starting to look at this too. And I think one of my bright spots is this recognition that philanthropy is not going to solve the problems. By and large, the big systemic issues that we are talking about, philanthropy might be able, like, here are some ways in which, here are some trials, right? But when we're looking at the big issues that need to be addressed, we have to go bigger, and it has to be pulled into the civic world. And so that interest in doing advocacy work, in making that explicit that the systems need to be shifted, that is very interesting to me. And that is something, the Washington Women's Foundation is also looking at advocacy. We did some advocacy granting this last couple of years, didn't quite do what we wanted, so we're readjusting and rethinking it, but that we are talking about it and doing it and having conversations about it and that this is not the only place that's happening, right? That I'm seeing this in a lot of foundations, is talking about advocacy and what are our limits, right? Recognizing that philanthropy can't really make those big shifts. And the other place I think I have some bright spots is the conversation around spending down endowments. This is one of those things, and like the half my DAF and these, I think it should be more than half. But anyway, this conversation that's starting to bubble up and starting to be pushed at in legislative arenas as well, to get the rules around the way in which those dollars that go into foundations come back out addressed. That is, to me, very interesting and hopeful that we're recognizing that, what is it? It's like $235 billion that's sitting in DAFs right now and not going out into community. I just read that last night, so I'm pretty sure that's accurate.
Yeah.
Horrifying how much money is just sitting there.
Last year, actually, I was looking at some of the giving reports. 85 billion was put into DAFs last year, which is a 9% increase from 2021. So if you look at the exponential rate at which DAFs are being utilized by individuals to as a vehicle for their giving, it has been sort of on a fast rise. So I think there are some
absolutely,
there's some structural pieces here, both with DAFs and other giving vehicles that are, kind of can augment some of the challenges we've seen.
Lauren, just really briefly, in case people are
definitions,
donor advised funds.
Donor advised funds, thank you.
The largest nonprofit in the United States now, I believe, is Fidelity Charitable.
Yep.
It is
in the world. The charitable organization in the world.
Yeah, so people they give to Fidelity Charitable, and that money is then in effect, they get the tax benefit for doing so, but then it sits with Fidelity Charitable until they decide to give it to where they want it to go. So that's what we're talking about here, is that some of this money isn't circulating as much. It's mainly just sitting in some of these, mutual fund companies, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's both dark, and the light side is that people are like, hey, that can't be the way, and that it's getting some play in bigger venues than just like sitting at a Zoom call with a bunch of people who are already in the know. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. I mean, the fact that philanthropy has often been used as a way to make people feel better about themselves rather than really make change happen. I've seen it happen, right? I've seen it happen as we changed things at Washington Women's Foundation, and members who left because they didn't feel like it was, they didn't feel as it wasn't quite as fun when we were saying, no, you're not doing it right. Like that wasn't it wasn't fun anymore to just sort of swan in and like look amazing. And that said, there's a bunch of women who are really excited about doing it differently. And I think that we can certainly encourage people to do it differently. And it's really fun on the other side to actually see some little things shift.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll say this is another question from our listeners. This we've also seen this, hopefully not a trend, but a shift that more foundations and institutional funders in particular are attentive to diversity, equity, inclusion matters. And I'm curious, do we have any sense if there's actually meaningful change happening as a result of some of these commitments that have been made? So I think I'd be curious to explore, David, in terms of if you're seeing anything in your research, also knowing that your research intersects with understanding this notion of professionalism and who've typically gotten grants, right? With this commitment, stated commitment, but actually meaningful movement in this space. So I'd love to take a minute to explore that with you.
I can say this, that foundations rhetorically are very much in favor of a lot of this, but when legislation has come out saying that they need to have X percentage people of color on the boards, or just that they have to disclose all of this stuff, they tend to oppose it. So there's a bit of a tension there that I think they are, at least in institutional philanthropy, there's genuine attempts, but there's also just as genuine opposition to this being done through regulation. So it's more self-regulation and efforts to at the individual foundation level to make change, as opposed to saying this is a problem that we as a sector need to address through the regulatory process and make this a legal obligation.
Anything you want to add, Maria, from sort of your perspective on the ground, and having worked in a number of, not just on the philanthropy side, of nonprofit organizations who've been in this space of serving vulnerable communities, and what you're seeing in your ability to attract resources from major donors and foundations?
Well, Lord, I'll be honest. Is there a lot to talk? A lot to talk. I think there is interest. I think there is some genuine interest in doing things differently in some circles. I think there was a great spasm after the George Floyd murder. I mean, there's been quite a few of them, but after George Floyd's murder, there was that spasm of everybody like, oh, yay, DEI, we're going to give to them. And that is drying up and shifting. That is, people are snapping back to ways in which they've done things previously. COVID also sort of exacerbated some of those changes that for a while there it looked, and foundations are re-entrenching, going back to the ways in which they did it before, and letting that be a hiccup. So that is my biggest concern, that some of those, and like you, David, I don't want to say like out of COVID came these amazing things, but there was that recognition for a while that there was something that needed to be shifted. And the ways in which have a real good way of pulling people right back into the old ways of doing. And I feel like I'm seeing some of that. Feel like I'm seeing more resistance to the way, sorry, just a second. My team, we have a big event tonight, and my team is excited, and there's a lot of noise. So I apologize if you're hearing that.
We
but okay, good. But that there is talk. There are certainly people who are starting to do things in new ways, and that's exciting. And there are also people who are not. I mean, there is no such thing as everything about this was bad. Everything about this was good. But I worry about the retrenchment. I worry about it a lot.
We're also seeing some really maybe somewhat disturbing like stagnation in giving overall. And I think something to surface that would lead into related to a question that from one of our audience members is there has been a massive consolidation of wealth in our country, right? We recognize now too, even if there are more charitable dollars going out the door, it's being done so by fewer individuals because of that consolidation. So one of our panelists is curious, given we see her name in the news a lot in this space, what do you think about yield giving, which is Mackenzie Scott's process? She's giving these large 1 million general operating grants that includes structured peer review, requiring additional time, energy from their applicants. Was this has this been ultimately a positive attempt to move towards participatory grant making, or has this become an additional burden placed on applicants to jump through the hoops? So that's the question. I don't know if we want to weigh on this specific case, and or also maybe how it's relating to how these kinds of things are influencing people, the perspectives in the philanthropic community when we're seeing these kinds of news stories.
So funny, because I had that exact thing written down on my notes of like, maybe talk about Mackenzie and the yield giving. So yeah, I got thoughts. I got things to say. I remember seeing that yield. I went through that whole proposal, like what you had to do to get that $1 million. That's just to be started. And that alone was a doozy. It was like the exact opposite of what Mackenzie has been doing up until now, right? This huge proposal. There was like videos it required. There were lots of testimony. It was a lot. Just the application itself was a lot. And then I started seeing in the nonprofit happy hour, for those of you who are not, I know not everybody's on Facebook, but for those of you who are on Facebook, if you are interested in nonprofit land and you are not looking at nonprofit happy hour, you really should, because there's a lot in there. And there were comments from nonprofits who had gotten past that first stage and had to do that participatory grant making aspect, who were hiring people because they didn't have the bandwidth to do that extra work of reading all those applications from other organizations. And this is something that we've seen. We try to invite grant makers and people from the community into some of our grant making spaces so that they can be part of the conversation and part of the decision making. We pay people to do that. And even paying people to, like, we're going to pay you to come in here and be part of our grant making, even that makes it difficult for us. It's hard to find folks who aren't busy, right? Who aren't doing too much already. Grant makers and funders need to give more so that people have the time to participate. I can't emphasize enough how little nonprofit folks get paid vis-a-vis like their for-profit counterparts. Come on, the UW just get the study. Come on with the wage equity study. In the resources, put the wage equity study that was done by the UW social team together, because it goes into the incredible disparity. Just in terms of how much money people are making, that alone gives you more time to do things like then be part of participatory grant making. So I think foundations, if they really believed in it, they got to pay for that too. That's part of the grant making. And like you said, David, it's part of the investment, right, into the community. Is part of that investment is we're going to invest space and time for you to come and be part of our conversation. So what do I think of it? I think it could have been done a lot better. That's what I think of it.
You know, there's some really great questions here in the chat, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but just to acknowledge about fiscal sponsors and mutual aid, just a variety of really good questions that merit attention. I am more, I guess, optimistic about some of what Mackenzie Scott's been doing. She's been giving away a lot. She's been giving it away fast. And
yeah, that I love.
Yeah, and she has been, once they have the money, at least from what I've heard, it has been, if not with no strings attached, it has been a lot less strings than you typically see from types of giving that aren't trust-based philanthropy. This yield giving is a specific, model, and it is participatory, and it's intended to try to enable a really competitive process that requires just bringing in more people to do this. And so it is a challenge, because you're putting more work on more people, including some of those who have applied are having to evaluate applications from organizations they're competing with. But this is not novel to participatory grant making either, right? This is a challenge, as Maria said, of how do you do this in a way that recognizes that, yes, you're asking something, but you're also doing it to try to improve not just grant making, but trying to build something. And so how do you make that happen? I do believe that people who were evaluating some of these applications were paid. It wasn't a lot, but it was like $50 and something like that. And so, yeah, they did get some money. Is it perfect? Obviously not. I think everything can be improved, but I don't know. She's been playing around with a bunch of different models, and I think this is one of them. So I would give her in this particular instance, the benefit of the doubt and say that she's trying to at least do something different and broaden it. And it's just hard to do anything novel without getting valid critiques, right? I mean, these aren't unfair critiques, but I think net, she's doing quite a lot that's good.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we discovered as we were making changes at the foundation, and Lord knows we have more that we could make without question. Change is messy. It's messy. Nobody does it right at the first go. And honestly, nobody's going to. Racism's been around for a while. We're not solving that. None of us on this call today are going to see the end of it. None of us. And all of us are in here trying to figure out how to make it better. Otherwise, we wouldn't be on this call. We would be having these conversations. And so I applaud, and I don't want people to think that like she hates Mackenzie Scott. Blah, blah. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. But that there's no way for us to improve if we don't sometimes say, hey, but what about that? Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, I do want to speak. I am well aware, Steve, I have many things I can say about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation too. So I get that. There are things that have gone very well. There are a lot that's problematic there too. So like I said, if you already knew how to make it happen, I would hope that you would already be doing it. And that's across the board. And I am 1000% included in that conversation about how do we, honest, what we're talking about, like how do we make the world a better place? And that's a big question. That is a big question. And philanthropy is certainly one of those tools that we have to use, right? That we can use to try and make the world better. It's not the only tool. It may not even be the best tool, but it is absolutely a tool. And if we could make that tool, our philanthropy tool, a little sharper, a little more effective, bravo, right? That's the work that we're involved in, that we're diving into, is how do we make it better so that we can see change happening from it. And that's something, you know, and I applaud anybody who's trying to, it's a lot better than the ones who aren't trying to do anything, right? I applaud billionaires. I don't applaud billionaires at all, but I like it better when they're at least trying to make something better. It'd be even greater if they paid bigger taxes and we could have schools that way. But, you know, I'm always wary to say nothing is black and white. And so I'm always wary of going too far in one direction. Mm-hmm. Work is complex and it is it's bigger than all of us. And we're all biting bits and pieces off that elephant. So,
yeah. Well, and I want to sort of just put a point on one thing you said. Charitable earlier mentioned too, philanthropy can't solve anything. And I also want to name that philanthropy sits within a larger context of some policy work around tax reform, right? And taxes, and then the charitable piece of this, and how do we administer on a policy level shifts? Because, you know, I think we've lifted up some really encouraging, maybe bright spots around practices, right? Things that you've chosen as an organization, like Washington Women's Foundation has chosen to do things a little differently and, you know, do the shift power to those who are closest to the work to make the decisions, et cetera. We did get questions, by the way, offline. You might get some questions on, did you have to change your bylaws? And like, again, maybe some org level policies, but you know, these are all voluntary things, right? These are with a private foundation that doesn't have community voice at their board or the trustee level be even aware, frankly, of some of the trends in philanthropy and doing this as a small private foundation and opting in. So I think there's a whole nother, we'll book you all for another hour sometime and dive into this conversation around some of the really like upper level structural pieces that some have been proposed over time. There was just a bunch of new conversation on DAF, donor advised fund regulations, earlier in the week. But to that end, I want to do a moment to say, let's do a quick resource roundup and some final thoughts from you. So from our audience, what I want to ask all of you, there's been some great resources already put in the chat. I saw someone called out the Ethical Rainmaker. I think we were talking a little bit about community-centric fundraising and if you're out there and you're a fundraiser or working on nonprofits, some of those pieces you should check out. So a call to participants now. Let's do a final resource roundup. Put in there the places you found helpful in thinking about how you do your work in this space of really trying to address the historical practices and inequities in our sector. And then from our panelists, I like to take a moment to just do kind of a final lightning round for each of you. If you had one thing you want our listeners to leave here today thinking about or noodling about, or again, we've got a lot of people who are working as board trustees or working as fundraisers. What do you want to just put a little piece of thing out there, an advice or a question or something for them to continue to noodle on from today's conversation around the way they carry this forward from today? Or maybe what you're going to continue to noodle on.
I guess if I were to make it personal and individualized, rather than thinking about this at the large scale policy level, for people that are in the audience that are grant makers or involved in philanthropy at some level, or just individuals who donate, if you care about this issue, think what you can do, building on this conversation, what you individually can do to push this in a direction that, if you care about this, philanthropy and equality, what steps you personally could take to move it in that direction. So rather than just thinking about it at the macro policy level, what does this conversation do in the direction of getting you to think about your giving and how it might change based on this conversation?
Yeah, I think my advice is also on a more personal level. I think one of the things that I ran into, both as a development person and even here at the foundation now on the other side of the wall, powerful people, and I speak to them more because I think they need more advice, need to get humble, right? A little more humility on the part of those who are powerful would go a long way. And in particular, there's a lot of talk about systemic oppression. That same system that oppresses people is lifting some people up. And so I think there's a lot of powerful folks who like to believe they got there on their own, and that same system that they say they want to fix didn't actually get them to where they are. And I think a little more critical thinking on that part would probably behoove them. And in part, that humility, though, is about recognizing, sort of as I began, what they don't know and who does. And the people who do are probably the people who are in it. I remember getting an email from one of our no longer members who said, "How dare you say that homeless people know more about how to get off the street than I do?" And I was like, "You have never been on the street." It was something else. And needless to say, our foundation now it has a different tactic and different voices, which is really great. But that attitude that because you're rich or because you're powerful, you know how to get that place is one that I would like to see powerful people in this country take a little think about, because like I said, those same systems, they lift up and they oppress. So get humble. I think I would say that with a lot of folks, educated people too. Get humble about what you don't know, but what other people are saying and how what they're saying could really open up your eyes to how the world might be a different place.
Absolutely.
And vote. Yeah, please vote. That'd be helpful.
Yes, the Evans School endorses that for sure. Well, thank you both. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. I hope all of you out there have found this discussion insightful. A particularly big thank you to Maria and David for both the work you're doing, like right on, Maria, keep on doing the work at Washington Women's Foundation on the ground, and David continuing to kind of watch this and help us make sense of it and help inform the field through your research. And thank you both for sharing your perspectives as well. So we'll be posting the recording from today and sharing a resource document with all those great things that have come up through our conversation and the resources that folks have put in the chat. We'll be working to get that out in the next couple of weeks to all of you. We hope to see you all again soon. I want to highlight that our next webinar will be our Dean's Forum on Race and Public Policy, which will be held on February 2nd on the topic of consumer protection. So talk about another system that can protect people or not, things like payday loan regulations. We know how that can impact certain communities harder than others. So we hope you all can join us for that. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Wishing you all the best, and farewell.